everybody to the second day of our conference on Sellars and the History of Philosophy. Our first speaker is Antonio Nunziante, the organizer, together with Luca Corti, of the conference. And the title of his talk is The Lingua Franca of Nominalism, Sellars on Leibniz. Okay, please, Antonio.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I do apologize for the poorness of my argumentation. Because, as you know, as a matter of fact, I'm here to learn because I'm a kind of beginner with Sellars. And as a matter of fact, I've always remained a beginner also with Leibniz. So the paper that I'm going to present is not built upon a single central thesis. The paper has been composed as an attempt to investigate a virtually unexplored theme of inquiry. So if you like, a kind of historiographical thesis may be put in the following terms. Leibniz can be considered among the remote but still significant sources of Sellars philosophy. Such thesis, however, is meaningless unless its conceptual relevance is displayed. Therefore, I will immediately add that Sellars' relation with Leibniz is focused on three main fundamental issues, which respectively concern, first, the concept of nature, two, the concept of truth, and three, the concept itself of nominalism. Besides, there are other seemingly minor topics which actually refers to the definition of abstract entities, of predicates, of proper names, and to the datum factum distinction. So faced with such an example subject, my working method has proved to be more like that of an entomologist rather than that of philosopher, because I had to make a preliminary data collection of the sources, the text, the lectures, and the direct and indirect quotations from which it is possible to reconstruct the Leibnizian portrait of Sellars. It is for this very reason that my work is not based on a single central thesis. It is rather a collection of different theoretical fragments that currently are not always mutually integrated. Another challenge I was faced with regards the fact that Sellars does not consider Leibniz only in himself, but he often positions him in a close relation to Kant. In some ways, Kant and Leibniz form a complex theoretical unity over above their differences, so I was forced to further fragment my exposition, so much so that it makes quite impossible for me today to expound it exhaustively. Finally, I think that this whole affair, made up of intertwined historical and conceptual relations, can be assumed as a vivid example of how Sellars meant the internal workings of philosophy in relation to the lingua franca of thought, namely to the history of philosophy. So now we can read the text. There is a premise. And I would say that to become comfortable with Sellars' interpretation of Leibniz, the first quote we might refer to is the following. I quote, "One of the most interesting topics a person wants to work on is the relation of certain features of Kant's thought to the corresponding features of Leibniz's thought. It isn't often stressed as much as it should be. Kant was really affected by Leibniz, the real Leibniz, not just the medical Leibniz. Now, one might try and say, what is the difference between Kant and Leibniz, give or take few arguments, few distinctions? There is a little more to that, I think. Kant is an idealist far removed from the sense in which Berkeley is an idealist. But the sense in which there are idealistic themes in Kant is much closer to Leibniz than the sense in which there are idealistic themes in Berkeley." End of quotation. There are thus certain features of Kant's thought that correspond to some other features of Leibniz's thought. And the way we believe Kant was an idealist does not have much to do with Berkeley, but rather with the way in which Leibniz, before him, was an idealist. Now, to take some first steps on this ground, we can start from the reconstruction made by Sellars of Leibniz's doctrine of complete concept. An opening quotation on which Sellars works is the classical one taken from the section 8 of the Discourse of Metaphysics. Leibniz says, it's a very a famous passage, it is indeed true that when several predicates are attributed to a single subject and this subject is attributed to no other, it is called an individual substance, but it is not sufficient. Such explanation is merely nominal. We must therefore consider what it is to be attributed truly to a certain subject. Now it is evident that all true predication has some basis in the nature of things, and that when a proposition is not an identity, that is, when the predicate is not explicitly contained in the subject, it must be contained in it virtually. That is what the philosophers call ines when they say that a predicate is in the subject. End of quotation. Now, in the meditation Leibnizian, Sellars begins to disambiguate the notion of individual concept by using two different types of references, which will gradually prove to be more and more intertwined. First reference concerns the question of proper names. The individual concept nominates the individual, but not in the sense in which we, finite subjects, nominate a possible individual, because in our case the names are merely a peculiar kind of general term, but individual concept is rather the proper name that God gives to each individual substance. It is the name that contains its whole history. So it is a divine concept, not a human one. The second reference focuses on the distinction between concept and nature, and specifies that the individual concept has a kind of double level of existence, because it exists in the divine understanding as a possibility, let's say, as concept, and it exists in re as the nature of a substance. Individuals seem therefore to have a double kind of dimension. On the one hand, they can exist only in a conceptual sphere, as if they were a simple logical possibility, while on the other hand, they can become, let's say, a tangible entity existing as natural substance. Now, what we are supposed to understand under the very concept of nature is not mentioned by Sellars in his meditations, but he refers to it in another essay from his earlier philosophical production dedicated to Aristotle, 1949. So here we read that the nature does not denote the mere capacity of a substance of doing something, the capacity, for example, of freezing or of boiling instantiated by water, but rather a kind of dispositional property. The difference, Sellars say, with respect to such mere capacities is that the dispositional property does not imply just a generic reference to the laws of nature, but involves a positive reference to a law associating that state with a certain kind of circumstance. That means that water is not only an abstract capable of freezing, but that it would do if temperature were reduced to 0 degrees. These positions, in Sellars' opinion, represent thus a kind of conceptual development of the classical notion of capacity, because they put some specific correlation between states and circumstances. And significantly, in this text dedicated to Aristotle, Sellars dedicates a note to Leibniz exactly in this context, informing us that, according to him, the circumstances to which a substance responds are, quote, other states of the same thing. As it were, Leibniz put the environment inside the substance itself. The environment becomes part of the representative states of an individual. We do not have on the one side the environment and on the other side the individual, but the substantiality of the latter has exactly to do with the fact of incorporating within itself the surrounding environment as part of its own history. So we come to the next point developed by Sellars. The nature of an individual substance must be understood in terms of episodes contained in its history. This means that the nature of an individual, if we but knew it, he would explain why it behaves as it does in the circumstances in which it is placed. In some ways, the nature of a substance captures all the episodic premises that lie behind the behavior of a certain individual. This is a Charlie Dunbar broad model that Sellars applied to Leibniz, which allows us to understand episodes in terms of conditional premises. That is, to construct a model in terms of facts of the following form. If at any time a substance S were to be involved in an episode of kind 1, then it would be also involved in an episode of kind 2. That means episodes can be chained together, forming the conditional premises of a syllogism in re. Now, such result as a matter of fact, produces a kind of modal stress, because Leibniz here combines two distinct models. On the one hand, he uses the so-called thing-nature framework of the Aristotelian tradition, but on the other hand, he uses the event law framework taken from the modern language of causal laws. This contrast is expressed by the distinction between nature of a thing, whose concept, according to Sellars, can be further specified in terms of a dovetailing set of dispositional properties, and law of nature. The first model, which is closer to the common sense, assumes the existence of some natural kind of things, and it assumes that they develop according to an internal framework. Besides, this assumes the ontological presence of an entity, the substantial form, which is presumed to be conceptually distinguishable from the properties that follow from it, and that generates the subsequent states of the individual in accordance with the different environmental circumstances. The second model, by contrast, does not refer immediately to things, but it focuses specifically on the law dimension. The modern scientist, Sellars says, does not know what kind of things there are until she arrives at laws which can be translated into the thing language. In this case, it's the nomological element that determines the properties that have to be fulfilled in order to be a thing. So that here we no longer speak of things, but rather of events, the latter being kinds of relational structures that do not spring from a central core, but consist in a process of reciprocal functional correlations. And now, going back to Leibniz, the nature of a substance would therefore have a kind of amphibious dimension, since it would contain both episodic facts, in accordance with the thing-nature framework of the Aristotelian tradition, but also hypothetical facts, in accordance with the modern even-law lexicon applied, for instance, by Broad. And indeed, given the presence of the principle of sufficient reason, the result would be that episodes are in fact hypothetical, and thus that the first model would actually collapse into the second. Sure enough, the principle of reason, in fact, refers to the idea that the entire series of episodes has a grounding in something that is not in turn episodic, but self-subsistent, namely God as self-explainer. Individual substances are therefore the result of a strange conceptual twist operated by Leibniz, and if we ask ourselves exactly where the source of such theoretical contamination lies, the answer has to do with Leibniz's strange idea of denial of relations. Whatever might happen to a substance, it must reside in the substance itself, once again, in its nature. The traditionally realistic conception of the relationship between substances and accidents, Sellars notes, had some difficulty, of course, in explaining the connection between individuals and universals. And according to Sellars, Leibniz would have therefore been working within this traditional context. And by renewing the lexicon of inherence, or accident that inhere to matter, he would have then pushed his nominalism to the limit by setting up a new epistemic status for relations. That was, according to Sellars, a brilliant metaphysical move, which in turn produced a kind of snowball effect, because it promptly modified the traditional views concerning the very concept of representation, the nature of truth, the relationship between real and ideal, and so on. This development, therefore, cracked from within some of the most solid epistemological principles of the early modern times, mainly founded upon the subject-object lexicon and upon the idea of veritas as adequatio rei et intellectus. As a matter of fact, Leibniz had opened the doors to the forthcoming Kantian revolution. Now, right at the beginning of the first quoted passage, Leibniz says that when several predicates are attributed to a single subject, and this subject is attributed to no other, then it is called an individual substance. And soon after, he adds that this is not enough, because such explanation is merely nominal. So we need to investigate what it is to be attributed truly to a certain subject. The point that seems to interest Sellars regards the term attribute, and particularly the fact that attributes cannot be conceived of as abstract entities. Sellars notes that here we are not really dealing with linguistic facts, because the background of the context is rather a theological one, and it refers to the knowledge that God has of individuals. So the idea is that our judgment, like Socrates' why, are true only if there is a kind of corresponding judgment pronounced by God. This is a highly problematic point, but this is a point stressed by Sellars. That means that in hypothesis, wisdom might not even figure among our identifying criteria of Socrates, as indeed it was not so for many of his Athenian peers. Because what really matters, if we speak of truth, is the basis in the nature of things. It is only in the divine judgments that predicates are necessarily contained in the subject. But we can also consider that from a different point of view, focusing on the problem of relations. If the nature of Socrates includes everything that is true of him at any time, then it will be also true of him that at some time in his existence he stood on the agora. In this case, we have to consider how a special relation, being on the agora, can be true of Socrates and how it can be included in his nature. We can tell in advance what is the target point of Leibniz's argumentation, which is well known. Relations have just phenomenal nature. But what we are supposed to understand now is what that exactly means. One important element to be considered, according to Sellars, concerns the distinction made by Descartes between formal and objective reality. In an act-content model of representation, namely, we have to distinguish between two ways of being. There is a second-class existence as a content that is dependent on the act of representing, and we have a first-class existence when we refer to something whose being is not dependent on a mental act. In this case, actual. Therefore, we have also two kinds of truths. There are things that are, let's say, metaphysically true, in the sense that they have an actual kind of existence, and there are also second-class truths concerning represented objects that are considered true only by virtue of the fact that they correspond to some entities of the first class, that was the Cartesian model. And this is a point of the utmost importance for Sellars. He says that this is the whole key of the epistemology of this period. And he says that here lies the source of the correspondence theory of experience, so which is rooted in a metaphysical framework. The point that seems relevant is that Leibniz's theory of relations works within this context, and it develops a seemingly correspondent conception of truth, but in fact it undermines it from the inside, because the very notion of correspondence and of counterpart will be, in this case, as it would later happen in Kant, completely rewritten. While for Descartes, as well as for Newton, actual things are those that are given in the absolute dimension of space and time, for Leibniz, everything that shows relational structure cannot have such kind of existence. Rather, it must always lean on a substance to subsist. For Leibniz, the idea of an extended universe that exists independently from the representation of its inhabitant does not make sense. We could say that at the very bottom of modern scientific and philosophical thought lies a radical schism. For Newton, but to some degree also for the empiricist tradition, the existence of what we call physical universe as an eminently space-time nature, which is independent from the presence of some possible observers. We have space, we have time, we have bodies, and all these would be present even in the absence of forms of life. This point was developed by Hans Jonas in The Phenomenon of Life in 1966. Leibniz, meanwhile, had another kind of intuition, which is quite the opposite. What we call the universe is, let's say, integrated with the presence of a world of percipient individualities, so that the objectivity of the former can be considered as part of the representativity of the latter. The physical universe does not stand alone, but it is integrated with a system of possible observers. Here I added a couple of Leibnizian quotations that were not produced by Sellars, but I allowed to my past Leibnizian scholarship to produce them. First quote is, Leibniz says, In the Leibniz-Clarke correspondence, there is not motion when there is no change that can be observed. And where there is no change that can be observed, there is no change at all. This refers, of course, to the deep root of his nominalism, because in a metaphysical sense, only substances and their properties exist. Second quotation, very famous among Leibnizian scholars, to a letter to Butcher de Volder, there is nothing in things except simple substances, and in them perception and appetite. Sellars' only quotation from Leibniz, as far as I know, are taken from the Discourse of Metaphysics and very little from the correspondence with Arnaud. Now, the consequences are obviously enormous, since the very idea that there is something absolutely actual in nature is questioned. Representing substances alone are actual, while the physical universe, with its space-time relations, becomes a world of objectivity, in the sense of represented objects. You can like it or not, Sellars says, but if you don't take this idea seriously, Leibniz doesn't exist at all. And after all, he added, all this is also what happens in Kant, because what he does in his critique, quote, is to pack a new meaning into the word actual. And indeed, Sellars adds here, Kant here is very close to Leibniz. To put it roughly, and this is, in my opinion, the kind of pivotal point, it is the very idea of actuality that was reshaped both by Leibniz and Kant, albeit in different ways. And due to this fact, they were both pushed to explore a new meaning for the expression being true. The sense of the old dictum adequatio mentis et rei, in fact, was now missing the material counterpart that in the Cartesian and Newtonian tradition was constituted precisely by the absolute spatiality of bodies. Definitio auto in corporis est spatio in existeres. That was the young Leibniz when he still shared the Cartesian views. Now let's try to examine the point more closely, only firmly the distinction between formal and objective reality, which is credited with the utmost importance by Sellars. Such distinction, as you know, is confirmed also in Science and Metaphysics, the overture of chapter 2, in which Sellars says that at the heart of the Kantian distinction between things in themselves and appearances is the contrast drawn by Descartes between formal and objective reality. Now, let's take, for example, a system of three monadic individuals, S1, S2, and S3. And try to understand how the phenomenal domain of space is engendered by their representation. In outer space, Sellars says, an object is between object and object, meaning by that spatial relations essentially involve an ongoing continuity as something being beyond something. The object, namely, occupies a certain region of space, which is further determined by the relation to another region of space, and so on, and so on, and so on. Now, in the system of our three monadic individuals, we have thus three monads, which in hypothesis are non-spatially related, but which are, according to the simplicity of their nature, capable of representative states. So now, let's suppose that the monad S2 represent S1, with the result that S1 will have objective being in S2. It will be represented. Let's further suppose that S1 represents S3. And let's think such representing acts in those broader terms of what Leibniz called petit perception. Thus, S2 represents S1, but furthermore, it also represents, unconsciously, of course, petit perception, the state of S1. How can we comment on this situation? We can say, Sellars says, that S2 has a first-order representation of S1 and a second-order representation of S3. But otherwise, we can say that S2 is representing S1 directly, and that is representing S3 indirectly. That is, we can speak of a mediate representing of S3. Needless to say, we can continue playing this game because we have to think of this logical frame as an ongoing process based on the idea that every monad is always representing every other monad and it is also representing every state of every other monad. In other words, quote, Leibniz thinks that our petit possessions are infinitely complex, not just in the sense that there are infinitely many of them, but that they are complex in an interesting dimension that is usually overlooked. They are infinitely complex in this nestedness, as I put it. End of quote. So the phenomenological experience of something that is beyond something, therefore, emerges from this continuous process of internal representative mediation. Broadly speaking, the metaphysical counterpart of the spatial beyondness is the indirectness of substances representation. The output is, that is all I'm driving at, Sellars says, concluding this train of thought, stressing the fact that we have a structural similarity between this nesting of representation and the correspondent spatial beyondness. From a phenomenological point of view, the farther a thing is away, the more indirectly it is represented at the level of the petit possession. So this is the metaphysical key, the metaphysical moral, if you like, of the story. Leibniz begins with the enunciation of what we ordinarily regard as real relations between objects, and then turns them into ideal relation that must be explained in terms of the nature of a substance. And the main question becomes now, why did Leibniz not think it was correct for objects to have spatial relationships, and why he did not leave things as they are? According to Sellars, the generating point of Leibniz's very counterintuitive solution is rooted in the puzzles that affected the classical, mainly Aristotelian, concept of substance, and particularly when it came to relationships between substance and accidents. When we say this leaf is green, that was classically regarded as a kind of inherence of an accident in a substance, and that posed the tough problem of understanding the relationship between this particular green, instantiated by this particular leaf, and greenness in general. Sellars said during his lecture, the problem becomes more vivid when we have two leaves that both have the same shade of green. Sellars say, imagine a kind of forest green Pittsburgh paint 59. So exactly the same shade of green. Shall we think, in this case, that each substance has its own personal green, or are we supposed to imagine that there is only one forest green 59 with two substances that exemplify it? In other words, here we get the classical contrast between the idea of an individual qualitative identity and the notion of a numerically identical universal. So that was, according to Sellars, the starting point from Leibniz. And Leibniz's idea, more or less, was the following. Relational predication can be expressed in the general form of S1 is in relation to S2. Hence the puzzle of figuring out where R, the relation, is exactly to be placed, because we can put R with S1, considering R as part of it. We can put R on the side of S2. We can imagine that R inheres to both terms or to none of them. But Leibniz's idea instead is to treat such proposition as a special case of S is P, so subject and predicate. And thus, as S1 is R to S2, S1 is P. That means Leibniz exposes the idea that there is an R to S2 predicate inherent in S1. Namely, he accepts the consequence that S2 must be in S1, in S. But as Sellars points out, he reinterprets such commitments in light of the Cartesian distinction between objective and formal being. Therefore, he interprets facts of the form S1 is R2 S2 like facts of the form S1 represents S2 because of its nature. Relations are thus transformed into representative states of a formally or actually existing substance. The relational fact is transformed into an ideal relation, which is a phenomenon bene fundatum, whose objectivity has nothing more to do with the idea of a naive realism shared by the early modern tradition. Because Leibniz's extreme position of nominalism is here intended as a way to escape both from naive realism, but also from abstract Platonism. Only actual substances are real, meaning by that natural entities endowed with own nature. Now I come to conclusion. This is the last paragraph I will read, because one of the most interesting applications of these patterns regard the fact that they can also be applied to causality. So facts of the form S2 is acted on by S1. So S1, by being in a state F, causes S2 to become P. So S2 is acted on by S1 becomes facts of the form. S2 is representing the fact that S1 is in the state F, and thus as S2 is representing S1. Once again, causes should be understood on the basis of the Cartesian distinction between objective and formal being. Causes, as also relationships, are representatives, not representings. The Leibnizian world is made up of individual substances, and the things they run into are part of their personal story, being the representational stuff that compose the fabric of their nature. Now, such view drives us again toward a previously considered problem. Assuming that causes and relationships have been transformed by Leibniz into ideal representation, the next step is to consider the nature of the bond that ties together the representative states of a substance. How are we supposed to interpret the nature of such bond? Is there not the aforementioned principle of sufficient reason, which urges us to interpret episodic facts in terms of hypothetical facts? Why not continue with broad, identifying the nature of a substance with the hypotheticals, while granting that both episode and hypotheticals are grounded in necessary being? Because it would be easier to follow this path, and the bond among representative episodes would be guaranteed by the very fact that, as it was quoted before, if at any time S were to be involved in an episode of kind 1, then it would be involved also in an episode of kind E2. But this is like, Sellars say, to assert something like this episode because that episode. And such insight marks the distance that separates Leibniz from our contemporary views. Because Sellars says why nowadays we tend to think on the basis of the distinction between causal properties as general hypotheticals and occurrent states as categoricals, Leibniz, like most of his predecessors, interprets causal properties on the model of desires, plans, personal commitments. Quote, thus, whereas we might be inclined to interpret the statement, Jones has a strong desire to go to New York, in terms of conditional facts about Jones, Leibniz thinks of a strong desire as a continuing series of episodes which tends to develop into going to New York and will continue to develop if not impeded. End of quote. That's the point. Leibniz tends to think that the becoming P of S2, so the becoming New Yorker of Jones, the becoming P of S2, is a matter of S2 having the plan of becoming P. In other words, he interprets the becoming as a kind of really doing something. And therefore, the plan of becoming P, although hypothetical in its character, is interpreted by Leibniz as a categorical fact about S2. There is a sense, Sellars says, in which for Leibniz all the fundamental facts of a substance are episodic in the sense of categorical facts. Now, the consequences concerning the notion of nature are huge, since nature no longer indicates, as it would seem obvious for us and for Broad, a law-like hypothetical function, which would provide an explanation of each episode by relating it with some other episodes. Rather, the nature of a substance is construed as its life plan, and Sellars says, as such, it has esse intenzionale, as the content of an abiding inspiration. End of quote. So the hypothetical law-like notion of broad is replaced by Leibniz by a concept of nature intended as something that is entirely present and involved in every single episode. Therein lies the logical explanation of the behavioral substance. Every single episode has a self-rule explanation, not just relational, because the relationships themselves have not a relational ground that is rooted in the life plan of each substance, which constitutes their nature. So to sum up and to come to conclusion, the individuality of a substance is identified by a fabric of representations in which causes and relationships are also absorbed. Every single representative episode is logically explained by the nature of the substance, that is to say, by the presence of a life plan that is entirely present in each single episode. The idea of nature as a pure law-like hypothetical is ultimately overcome, because it is the possession of a life plan that explains every single episode and that makes it autonomous. Now, this is just half of the story, this is part of the story, because in this complex framework, there's something that still lies in the background, a key term that should be considered, but we don't have time to do it, because in some way it provides the cache of the Sellarsian interpretation of Leibniz. The term at stake here is, of course, that of truth. But I stop myself here because such reference to truth involves also Kant. So maybe we can leave it for the discussion also today. Thank you very much for your attention.